Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to another panel on data for governance. My name is Stefan Verhulst. I'm the co-founder of GovLab, which is an action research center here based in New York. We are part of New York University, but have a global footprint in order to focus on the question, how can we improve the way we make decisions, leveraging new technologies, new tools, and new assets. And one of those assets that we are focused upon is obviously data. And for the last few years, we focused on how can we leverage data in order to improve the way we govern, in order how we go about improving the way we make decisions, designing public services, or solving public problems. And I'm delighted today to have a panel that will focus on the questions of how can we improve the way we go about using data to actually make governance more legitimate. And that's within the context of an initiative which is called the 100 Questions Initiative, which seeks to identify the 100 questions that can be or could be answered if we find a way to unlock data. Our belief and assumption behind the 100 Questions Initiative is that we should start with the questions, not the data, in order to really identify and prioritize how we can start using data. One of the domains that we have focused upon is obviously governance. And that's a domain where we focused on how do we identify the questions that matter around governance. Is a domain that we developed together with a range of partners, including the Asia Foundation, the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Indonesia, as well as the BRAC Institute of Governance and Development and in Bangladesh. And as a result, we have identified 10 questions. And at the moment, we are having a public voting campaign in order to identify what are the priority questions that not only the experts have identified, but also the public at large feels is worth developing data initiatives around. And within that context, we also are holding a set of expert plenaries and expert panels. And today is one of those panels that I'm delighted to be able to moderate as well. And as I already mentioned, we have a tremendous panel. And let me briefly introduce who we have today and then go straight into the discussion. First, we have Claudia Schwalitz, who is the lead of the Innovative Citizens Participation effort at the OECD. Thanks, Claudia, for being here. Then we have Michael Baker, who is the Senior ICT Advisor on the Innovation, Technology and Research Hub at USAID. Thanks so much for being here, Michael. And then we have Megan, or Meg, Nalbo, who is the country representative in Nepal of the Asia Foundation, as already mentioned, is one of our core partners in the effort as it relates to 100 Questions for Governance. With that, let us start it. And my first question to all of you is, why should we care about the use of data for governance to make governance more legitimate? And do we have any evidence that data does make an impact on governance? And why don't we start with Michael?
All right, thank you, Stefan. Yes, we definitely should care. Some governments do use data well, others don't necessarily view it as a strategic asset, might have siloed data ecosystems or agencies or ministries within government that aren't effectively sharing data, even if they have it. Data and evidence-informed decision-making can improve transparency and can be used to make informed policy and program decisions and should be used to inform those policy and program decisions. I'd like to share, I think, what is a promising use case and a promising strategy related to these. In terms of use cases, we've seen development of national digital and ICT strategies has really picked up in the last 10 years. These strategies help governments build roadmaps and set digitalization and digital transformation priorities. Not every government has the resources or the capacity to fully implement these strategies. but developing them and publishing them publicly can help government agencies and ministries know their roles. It can enable the private sector and multilateral and bilateral donors know where they can close gaps in capacity and resources. And another promising strategy is that I'll share as an example from Estonia. Governments some are implementing data exchange layers now, such as the X-Road, which is being used in Estonia. It's an open source data exchange layer developed by the government of Estonia. It's available to other governments. The government of Estonia has an e-governance academy through which they provide technical assistance, capacity building, et cetera, to other governments. USAID actually has a partnership with this e-governance academy. But backtracking a bit, a data exchange layer is essentially a piece of software that facilitates information system interoperability by translating and connecting data between information systems, such as between government agencies and ministries. And a key barrier we see inadequate data use in country data ecosystems is that many of them are siloed and fragmented, with government agencies and ministries having different data standards, different legacy systems that aren't compatible, different approaches to data sharing, different data culture, and non-interoperable legacy information systems. Data exchange layers can enable government agencies to improve their reuse of data, reduce their collection of data, and the related burden on the public, and to facilitate interoperability. One last thing, that data exchange layers between governments can also be connected, such as is the case between Estonia and Finland, to facilitate sharing from one government to another. So I think that's a exciting development, and I'd like to see more of that in low and middle income countries.
Great, thanks so much, Miguel, and very interesting to indeed focus not only on the element of legitimacy, but also efficiency. And that obviously this is not just about making governance more transparent and accountable, but also making it more efficient so that actually services are delivered in a more cost-effective and targeted way as well. Thanks for that. Meg.
Thank you so much. So why should we care? I guess, in the context of South Asia and Nepal specifically, part of the reason that I believe we should care about data and its utilization in governing systems is as we look at the dynamic nature, increasingly dynamic nature and complexity and interactiveness of governing systems, regardless of type, but the qualities remain, that is only going to increase over time. And part of the quality that I see of that, we know that in governing systems, part of that dynamism comes from traditional town halls and discussions, as well as within and amongst civil society. Within Nepal, we also see that data as a point of departure for discussion has dynamic qualities that also really importantly can bring in very diverse voices in interpretation. And in that dialogue and the meaning making and the knowledge generation from that interaction, we really see that greater refinement and nuance of the needs and the preferences of communities come out, along with the limitations and opportunities from government to be responsive. Therein, we see that policy then can be more refined and best fit. There's no perfect policy. And in Nepal, we've historically been quite plagued by the fact that we get perfect policies, but because there's not that participation loop in the generation of understanding from data points, then we get into the narrative that it's impossible to implement these otherwise technically perfect policies. So a couple examples that we see in Nepal where this has been shown to be effective in governing systems. I'll give four different examples very quickly. One is there is a Women in Data group that has come together, a number of different civil society organizations and experts in the field And we've been very pleased to support that the last several years in partnership also with the UK government. And this is a group of innovative women that are looking at not only upskilling diverse women across Nepal, but also saying that this voice actually gives us different interpretation of the exact same data set, whether it's the national statistics or it's civil society generated data. And that their voices then, they are able to come together, aggregate some key points, and then bring that to government at various levels for policy revisions. Another area we've seen is around in Nepal's still nascent federal state, increased demand for data around waste management. And that is something that we've seen as that data has been, a number of different data sets have been available to municipal governments. They're able to make more informed decisions. And we know that in Nepal, at least, waste management is highly politicized. And as an elected official, not very popular to be making decisions around where waste management sites should be, how the distribution process works, and so on. And so bringing data set to those decisions actually has been, initial evidence suggests that it's been wildly helpful for municipal governments. We've also seen in Nepal, disaster management is an ever-present reality of governance in Nepal. Both the predictable disasters, natural disasters around annual flooding and landslides, but also the unpredictable, more unpredictable, as we've seen in the 2015 earthquakes. And so disaster management information systems innovated within civil society and ultimately adopted by the central government and rolled out now at municipal levels for utilization and planning, budgeting and planning, planning around their urban layouts, planning around basically every part of governing at the subnational level. And then finally, I think the most obvious and where we see the most recent wealth of information on how it is data can be useful in governing is in health governance through the pandemic, and looking at innovative places where at local levels, systems, data has been able to be collected, rapid collection, rapid analysis, rapid visualization and dissemination around where are there free hospital beds, where are there free oxygen tanks, and so on. And this has been critical where there are otherwise no information systems available to connect people with services. So let me just, yes, data and governance is.
Thanks so much, Meg, for that comprehensive overview, and also thanks for emphasizing the role of data also at the subnational level, because obviously this is not just about governance at the national level, but we've seen and we do a lot of work also on how we can actually leverage data at the municipal level, including actually in Nepal as well. But also, thanks for anyway highlighting the need to actually use data as a method to actually understand a better situation analysis on the ground as well before we go about making decisions. Over to you, Claudia. Why do we care or should care? And any examples that provide evidence that it makes a difference.
Yeah, thanks, Stefan. And I think it's nice actually that I can go after Meg, because she's already made some reference to the value of involving citizens and the link with data there. And given my role working on innovative citizen participation, I'll address this through that lens, because I've been doing a lot of work for the past years on deliberative democracy in particular. So processes like citizens' assemblies and citizens' juries and so on, where you create the conditions for a broadly representative group of people to have the time and the resources and the information to understand a complex issue, to grapple with that complexity, to deliberate, to listen to one another, and then with an explicit aim of finding common ground. And so data actually and information plays a huge role in these processes. And I think it's a big departure to more participatory efforts where it's more about perhaps bringing in people's top of mind opinions, which can obviously be valuable and important in certain contexts. But I think what's different with deliberative processes is that you're creating the conditions for people to actually take in a large amount of data, to understand that, but then also to put that in the context of all of their lived experiences. And there's a great amount of research which shows that having that cognitive diversity leads to better decisions than when you have just a homogeneous group of experts around a table to make that decision. So we're seeing that actually having these sorts of processes in place to help with decision making on complex policy problems actually can lead to better decisions. I think there's another interesting sort of effect of data, though, in the sense that I think that that learning process actually has a transformational effect on the people that are involved. So if we take the example, for instance, of the French Citizens Convention on Climate, I was watching just a few days ago, actually, there's a new film that's come out with interviews of the 150 people that had been selected by a lottery to be part of this. They were filmed during the process and also afterwards. And it's just so fascinating to hear directly from these people about how learning all of this information has had a profound impact on their own behavior. So a lot of them have become vegetarian. Some people were talking about how they've stopped driving and are now taking their local groups or associations or much more active kind of in a political way. So many of them have changed jobs to do something which is much more linked to climate action now. So obviously the problem on the one hand is that there's a fairly small number of people that are involved in any one of these processes at one time, which is also why one of the aspects of the work we're doing at the OECD around this is how can we scale this, in the sense scaling not in terms of involving thousands of people in one go, but scaling in terms of these processes being used all the time on all sorts of complex issues at all levels of government as well, because we see that there's actually a massive potential there for creating a much more active and mobilized citizenry. And I think also with much better public communication as a tool for public learning, because we saw, for instance, during the Citizens' Assembly that took place around abortion in Ireland, there were around 100,000 people that watched the live streams from both the experts and the stakeholders, which, both of them are providing different forms of data to a wider public. I think there's really a big potential here. And the problem will then be in some ways for politics, because, watching this film the other day with the citizens from this assembly, they're like, the politicians, they know all of these reports from the IPCC and all these other things, and they're not taking the action we need in relation to this data. So, I think we're at an interesting kind of turning point as well when we're creating the conditions for people to be listening more directly to experts and scientists, because actually they're much more willing to be taking on board what they say than politicians are sometimes. So yeah, I think I'll maybe leave it there in answer to this question, and we can pick up on some of that after.
Thanks so much, Claudia. And yes, I do want to unpack some of that later on as well, especially also as it relates to data and how we can have a deliberation around the use of data, and which is something that quite often we don't see happen enough from our point of view. Well, thanks all of you for this those introductory remarks. And so let's unpack some of those elements. And let me start with Michael, really about the issue of digital transformation and data. And obviously there is, anyway, a lot of discussion about e-government and the application of digital to government, but quite often that's absent from then, or different than, the discussion about data and government. And somehow those two streams quite often are not fully connected. But obviously digital transformation, one of the biggest assets from my point of view is actually data. And quite often we ignore that by making government digital, we actually do have also additional data sets. And so how does this play out, Michael, in your work? Have you seen the whole discussion about digital transformation also become more of a data-driven kind of discussion? And what are the implications especially for organizations like the one that you are working for, where you actually want to make a positive impact on using those tools for development. Has that changed the toolbox as well? And how do you go about this?
Like you said, Stefan, I have seen digital transformation separated from data more often than I see the two topics connected. I think they should be inseparable. Some colleagues and I and others at USAID and in other agencies are making the obvious connections, but in many cases, they're separate discussions, and digital transformation is more like that as a service delivery issue or application development issue, like many other digital development topics where data is I guess, so ubiquitous that it's kind of left out of the conversation, or there are assumptions made that of course that is part of it, but we don't need to talk about it. Yes, they're inseparable. You know, data, information systems, applications, and user interfaces are key in digital transformation. Digital economy, digitally enabled government services, and digital feedback loops are all underpinned by data, as are many other emerging technologies. But data aren't part of the conversation often. And some considerations to share on data handling and approaching data are developing and implementing robust and comprehensive data governance policies. I think are key to governing how data are produced, used, and shared in the public and private sectors. Creating digital feedback loops. You know, similar to what Claudia mentioned. I'm talking about it possibly more in the sense, you know, not necessarily directly tied to governance, but to decision making within sectors, on program priorities for governments. But creating digital feedback loops can empower citizens and incorporate them into decision-making processes and make these processes more data-driven. Empowering citizens this way can improve their data literacy, can improve their trust in government, and increase transparency in decision-making processes. One thing I have seen is that many governments have made progress in implementing data protection and privacy policy in recent years. There's, you know, been a sort of copy paste of GDPR. I think that a lot of that is maybe keeping up with the Joneses or ensuring that their digital economies and digital ecosystems aren't handicapped and are still able to participate in you know, the global data economy. But that narrow view, I think, leaves out many of the other pieces of the data life cycle, and you know, the focusing on the data protection and privacy, it's a risk aversion strategy and risk mitigation strategy, whereas I think there's a lot of room to be thinking more about how data are produced, used, shared, improving data culture within government, building trust within between the government and the private sector, and some of the issues there, I think, are that data protection and privacy policies are underdeveloped and under-resourced in some places. There aren't data stewardship authorities or individual, like data protection officers in some places, that are empowered enough to aid in implementing these policies, and it would be ideal to strengthen these authorities within government and have more empowered data stewards in government. Some of the privacy considerations I've seen, you know, it's important to anonymize publicly available data to protect individuals' privacy, ensuring that public sector information systems, especially those that can be accessed by the public or by organizations outside of government, have adequate cybersecurity measures, ensuring that citizens' data are protected and that laws on privacy and data protection are actually enforced, not just there as, you know, placeholders, and ensuring that trusted government partners can access government data and that they'll use it responsibly.
Great, thanks so much, Michael, and I think thanks also for bringing in the data governance aspect, right? Because obviously we're talking about data for governance, but data for governance obviously needs to have data governance itself, and I think great that you already brought that into the conversation as well, because I think they should be developed together, obviously. And great also that you mentioned data stewardship, because that's, of course, one of the areas that we at GovLab also working towards. But one of the aspects, Claudia, of data stewards that we are envisioning is also to have individuals not only thinking about the misuse of data, but also about the missed uses of data, and especially to identify those potential misuses by engaging with the public around what are some of the priority, what are some of the questions that they care about that we actually should use data for. And you mentioned already a lot of innovation in the deliberation space. And I think this weekend, we had a whole deliberation about the future of Europe. I don't know whether Europe has a future as a result, but the question is, of course, that have you seen any examples, or do you feel that we need more examples around by which we actually leverage those assemblies, for instance, to focus on data and the use of data in governance? Meaning, clearly you already identified the role of data in public engagement, but what about public engagement about the use of data, and how can we innovate that as well? Over to you, Claudia.
Yeah, that's a very good question, Stefan. And I think, but before I jump into a full answer on that, I'm just going to take 1 second to actually define what I mean by a citizens' assembly, because I'm also conscious that it's something that's probably new to many people still, and it's very different from a town hall meeting. And it's so just to know what we're talking about, or at least what I'm talking about when I give some examples here. So these are processes where at the heart of them, there's a group of broadly representative people who are brought together by something which is called a civic lottery. So usually this involves 2 stages of selecting people. In the first instance, there's a very large number of invitations that goes out, somewhere between 10 to 20, 30,000, completely at random, inviting people to be part of this citizens' assembly, explaining what the question is, what the task is, how much time they'll have, who will answer it. Usually this invitation comes from like the mayor or the minister or President Macron in the French example I mentioned earlier. So someone with authority, asking them to be part of the process. And then amongst everybody who responds positively to this invitation, there's a second lottery that's conducted, and this time controlling so that the final group is broadly representative of the population in terms of things like gender and age, socioeconomic status, and so on. So at the heart of the process is this group, and they usually have a lot of time. So in the OECD research, we find they have at least 4 days on average to be able to first learn, hear from experts, hear from stakeholders, understand the complexity of an issue, time to deliberate with skilled facilitation about what they've heard, but bringing in their lived experience. And then the goal is really to find common ground, to collectively develop recommendations, where usually there's a very high threshold of support for it to become a recommendation of the group. So usually around 80% is that kind of cutoff. And those recommendations then go into a report written in people's own words that go to the public authority. So there's like quite a lot of things in place which distinguish this as something that has representativeness, needs to have impact, time, information, learning, deliberation. And so I think that these sort of processes are actually kind of ideally designed for dealing with an issue like data governance, for instance, because you're creating the conditions for people to grapple with complexity, to understand an issue in depth, but also to weigh the values-based and ethical concerns, because these are not just technical questions, right? These are questions that pertain to how we want to live together as a society at the end of the day, and questions about how our data is used and for what purposes and who has access to it. And, you know, is there compensation or not? Or are there instances where it should be forbidden, etc.? Those all have really big societal and political implications. And I'm not sure we've seen too many examples. Like, I know that you have been involved with one process around this in particular. One thing I think to maybe have a look at more in depth for people interested is that for 3 years, starting last year in Canada at the national level, there's been a series of 3 citizens' assemblies on democratic expression. So kind of quite a wide-ranging topic, but the main issues at the heart are actually about questions about digital technologies, and all sorts of aspects about, it goes also into misinformation, disinformation, effects of the big platforms on our lives in many ways. But I think one aspect of it is around data governance as well. And so the second of those 3 citizens assemblies is underway now, and there'll be another one next year. So in terms of like a big and national level deliberation going on these issues, it's something to take a look at.
Great. And yeah, no, that's a great example. And definitely we will look into this more into detail indeed. And yeah, as you mentioned here at GovLab, we did, anyway, it was not we called it an assembly, but it was not at the scale that you are defining it. But anyway, what we called was the data assembly, which was a smaller effort here in New York City, where we focused on, anyway, engaging with citizens around the reuse of data for public interest purposes as well. But going back to Meg, and you already mentioned the use and the potential use of data, for instance, for disasters, which I think was an interesting one, and actually meaning one of the use cases that we quite often use to document the value of alternative data sets, such as, for instance, telecom data for governance, is quite often the example of the 2015 Nepal disaster, where which was one of the first times where actually telecom data was used in order to map how people were anyway moving around following the earthquake, and then that allowed for the disaster relief agencies to actually be more targeted because they actually knew where the people were, as opposed to assuming where they might be. And I think that was a great example of an alternative data infrastructure, i.e. cell phone data, to be used. But obviously, you still need a foundational data infrastructure, such as a statistical system. And obviously, you need a ground truth to actually even do this kind of alternative data analysis, i.e. a census. And so we've seen in Nepal an investment there, and wondering, Meg, how you see the importance of those kinds of both traditional, i.e. government statistics, and non-traditional data infrastructures, and how do you feel, should they evolve over time, and what's the role of organizations like yourself to actually start leveraging, but also helping build those kinds of infrastructures?
Thank you so much. It's hard to, in many countries where there are well-established systems, it's hard to comprehend how foundational they are in the entire ecosystem, but just how governing works, period. And I'll give the example of Nepal and some of both the census enumeration, which began in November, just a month ago, as well as some of the broader adjustments in Nepal. So to begin with, the recent census enumeration is historic in Nepal because it is the very first under the country's 2015 constitution. This constitution just very quickly moved Nepal from a unitary system of governing to a federal system, reducing local governments from 4,000 to 753, and introducing a provincial level of government. So completely restructuring. Nepal chose a big bang approach to this, so really jumping in headfirst with the constitution and then figuring things out as it proceeded on, all within 5 months of those earthquakes that you were referring to. Needless to say, this is all entirely new, and the Central Bureau of Statistics has needed to completely revamp its system to respond to these new administrative units, but then also their own needs for data and decision making. So this census will really, the data will begin coming out not until 2022, and then some after the elections, and it will serve as basically a baseline for under this constitution. And it also, over the coming months, it'll increasingly show us where those challenges have been in revamping the national statistics collection system. The one way that the CBS has been looking at rolling out this data enumeration and hopefully the data sharing subsequently is adapting its system to establish subnational coordination committees. And initially, we support a few different efforts in not only working directly with the Central Bureau of Statistics, the Asia Foundation in coordination with others, but then also with election census observation groups. And these observation groups have shared with us initial observations that where in localities where these coordination committees have been more effective, local government and civil society more involved in the lead up to the enumeration process, we've seen more effective enumeration itself, eager anticipation, clarity of responses, and so on. So we'll be watching this to see whether or not in those final reports that proves to be the case of active involvement in the statistics system at this early stage. We know, of course, that the intent of the census data itself is for the national government, for its multi-year and annual planning, budgeting processes. That being said, in recognition of the needs of the local government, the Central Bureau of Statistics is in discussion figuring out how it can better share data with local and provincial governments at the disaggregated levels for their own planning purposes. What will be interesting to watch is local governments since the 2017 first election under the Constitution, these are local units that had no database because they were historically different administrative boundaries. And so many local governments created their own data sets through household surveys, contracting it out. And it'll be interesting to see, there will be places of discrepancy between locally collected data sets from the past few years and national statistics. And so in Nepal's federal system, it will be important to watch how those contestations around the data evolve, how they are reconciled, and how that contributes to acceptance or contestation of the national statistics. I could go into greater depth. The entire system has been revamping. We've seen this in particular around line ministries, health, education, information management systems. I mentioned disaster and COVID management information systems. The Ministry of Federal Affairs and General Administration has been supporting piloted, more standardized frameworks for data collection without overly stepping on the mandate of local government and provincial governments, a more autonomous role and function in a federal system. But we have seen incremental shifts. We also see, I think Miguel had mentioned this, but as an example of importance, which is having personnel in place at different levels of government. In Nepal, that they're called IT officials. They tend to be computer operators. We've seen some positive deviance in some municipalities where they've established data units to help aggregate and coordinate various data sets at the local level. So we are seeing, the entire system has needed to restructure and be responsive to not only the needs and demands of various subnational government systems, but also the national. And I think this is heartening when people ask me, how do you think federalism in Nepal is going? I say, this in and of itself, the structures in place, the backbone, the fingerprint that helps us gather and aggregate data and make sense of what we're seeing. And then the incremental shifts we're seeing have been important. So maybe I'll end there. There's so much more that could be said, but I'll stop there.
One follow-up question, what's the role, because anyway, we've been working with, and actually we had here at GovLab, a fellow that was from Nepal working on the open data initiative within Nepal, proving that anyway, the role of civil society in actually building that kind of data capacity. And I don't know whether, anyway, you've seen that evolving now that the government has become more, data capable as well, or whether you see the role of civil society only increasing.
Thank you so much. Yes, I spoke very much about the backbone of the government-led systems. I mentioned before the disaster management system was an independent effort. It was a piloted project, and that we were pleased to support through a data challenge call for small grants. And it just took off because it so much met the needs, and ultimately has been owned by the Ministry of Home in their role in supporting disaster planning and management and response. So we see a number of examples. Even waste management has brought together a local organization that focuses heavily on sort of green solutions and data. And then the role that we've been able to play is in some of our partner municipalities where there's demand, where there's sort of that pain point of needing to solve waste management, and then bringing together where there are innovative solutions to pilot and test, which has been, what we've seen is that it has also increased the utilization. Not unlike this project of 100 questions. When you bring people involved early on, then they own the data, as imperfect as it may be, but they actually utilize it more frequently. I think, you know, with the adjustment to federalism and civil society, there are absolute pockets of innovation in thinking about solving real life challenges in urban areas and rural areas. Probably more so in urban areas, but and working with the government, working independently. Media has always been, in all of our SNAP surveys, has always been the greatest utilizer of data. The least, interestingly enough, is private sector here in Nepal. And I think that the census data will also offer them a roadmap. So they've been able to go municipality by municipality to try to gather information to help analyze not just media, but civil society more generally, but to have publicly available data will help create a backbone for their own analysis and means of accountability loops with various levels of government.
Thanks. Claudia, Meg was referring to the potential and the challenge of contestation with regard to, anyway, not only federal versus subnational data, but also just contestation, I guess, about, anyway, what's the data that is being presented? What are the questions the data answers is already, anyway, a political kind of discussion quite often. Anyway, is this the right question, or is it something else that we should actually focus on? And how does this play out in the role of data for the types of deliberation that you were referring to? Because to a large extent, data could also be misinformation if it's presented in a particular kind of way with a particular agenda. And so how do you go about, anyway, the appropriate use of data to actually inform political or public deliberations?
I think that's a very good question, because it really brings to light the fact that data in itself is not neutral, that it also exists within a context, and the same data could also be used to be telling different stories as well. One of the questions actually, which is the hardest to answer but is the most important, is how do we choose the information that gets presented to people in a deliberative process? And so this is why what we tend to emphasize is the importance of having breadth and diversity of data, rather than necessarily claiming anything is balanced or even neutral, but rather presenting having a large array of information, and both from, let's say, experts and academics, but also I think it's important for there to be information that gets presented from stakeholders, and again, a diversity of stakeholders. And then on top of that, something that we emphasize, we published last year OECD Good Practice Principles for Deliberative Processes. And in the one that's about information, there's also the point that the people who are part of the process should be able to request additional information if they need it. So, you know, it's rare that anyone asks for a specific expert that they want to hear from, but they might want to better understand a certain part of the issue that they're dealing with, or they might feel like, well, we've only maybe heard one perspectives. So we would also like to hear if there's people who disagree with this perspective. And that's also why having enough time is another of the principles of good practice, because when you leave time in between these meetings, and it allows the organizers to be able to find and provide that additional information, and it also gives people time to really digest everything they're learning too. And this also, I think, lends to the, or like adds to the legitimacy of the whole process, and for it to be taken seriously, both by the decision makers, but also by the wider public at the end of it. Because if you have this really complex question, and often sometimes controversial question, usually policymakers use these processes for like the hardest problems they're dealing with, because there isn't just one obvious answer to them. Having such a process in place where you can say, well, we gave this problem to a diverse group of people, we gave them the time, the resources, everything that they heard is transparently available also to the public, and this is what they have proposed to us. You know, you can have a great deal more legitimacy to then act on that than without something like this in place.
Muted. Thanks. Yeah. Great. Back to you again, Michael. Is I mean, a lot of the work that we've done around data, we came to the realization that for many of the questions that we are working on, quite often the data you don't have, someone else has. Quite often the expertise to even leverage the data you don't have, but someone else has. And quite often the domain expertise that is needed is also not present. And so what we've been working on is actually this, anyway, need for a new kind of public-private people institutions that really can, anyway, bring together both the data, but also the expertise. And so wondering from your perspective, Michael, whether in order to, anyway, for instance, answer the questions that we have identified, how do we go about this from a public-private people partnership kind of point of view? And have you seen any good examples in the space that you're working?
So yeah, this is a tough nut to crack. Like you said, in many cases, it isn't an issue of not enough data being available. It's that the data, or not enough data existing. It's that the data aren't available and aren't shared between stakeholders. You know, these data are hoarded. I think public-private partnerships are crucial for creating responsible data sharing structures and de-siloing and defragmenting data ecosystems. Public-private partnerships between government, civil society, private sector can improve government's data culture, willingness to share data, and capacity to handle and share data. Some of these key barriers include mistrust between stakeholders, hoarding of data by stakeholders such as ministries, and failures to recognize data as a shared resource that can have more value when in the hands of more stakeholders. You know, even within some country governments, one ministry won't share data with another ministry. You know, there are power struggles that are in political issues behind the scenes, which limit data sharing in those cases. These ministries hold their data closely and are hesitant to share it, and to share it with stakeholders outside of government. Like I said, in many cases, the data exists but aren't being shared, or aren't easy to compare or to be used or harmonized, or aren't aggregated. You know, making sense of disparate data from many different data sources takes a lot of resources and a lot of time to put into data cleaning, data transformation, and data aggregation. Some of the institutional capacity limitations can be addressed on multiple fronts. You know, one angle of attack is to, where possible and where resources permit, put more requirements in position descriptions for government staff to look for more data literate staff that are more comfortable working with data, to incorporate into secondary school and university curricula more data literacy elements, and not just in computer science and data classes, but across practice areas and education areas, to build data literacy and capacity of students so that the workforce is more capable of working with data and handling data, and governments and development actors like multilateral donors and bilateral donors need to foster growth of country digital ecosystems so that civil society organizations and private sector organizations are sufficient in number and capacity to provide services, technical assistance and training to government to be able to analyze government data, to be able to produce data that can be used by the government, and also to be able to use and react to the government's data and help governments make sense of that data. And just really quickly, one thing, I guess an emerging area of public-private partnerships I think is quite exciting and that is developing now are some of the, I guess, emerging data stewardship and data governance structures like data commons, data fiduciaries, data trusts. I think many of these are being piloted at small scale in many countries, but aren't really at the national level or at scale just yet. And I think there's a lot of promise in some of these approaches in how they could, be a new structure to empower citizens and to form new types of public partnerships to govern data and improve data sharing in these data ecosystems. And actually, USAID is working on a project related to this in to be determined countries, but focusing on a smaller scale, not a national scale, but looking at the education sector and how some of these emerging data stewardship and data governance structures could empower students and build their data literacy by incorporating them into data-driven decision-making and how their data are collected and used in this education system.
Great, thanks so much, Mikhail. And obviously, very interested to see those new kind of emerging partnerships. And so one of the initiatives that we have is called the Data Collaboratives Initiative, where we've identified, about 200 kind of emerging models in that space. And so the key challenge, as you said, is how do we go beyond pilotization, right? Because a lot of those efforts are experiments, but don't really scale up. And that's where you actually do need to have governance of the data, because a lot of the challenges are not just technical, it's really governance challenges, which leads me to last question for Meg, and then I will ask everyone to briefly also reflect on, of the 10 questions that have been prioritized and are now up for voting, which one do you feel is the one that you would vote for and why? But Meg, before we go there, which goes back to governance, obviously the premise here is that data can improve governance, i.e. make it more legitimate, more accountable, more transparent, but also more effective. But do we need to have a legitimate governance in place in order to actually leverage data meaningful as well? And you work in a region, as Mikhail does as well, where quite often that kind of legitimate governance or trusted governance doesn't always exist. And as a result, data could actually become more of a problem than a solution on how it is actually being used. And so how do you go about that, Meg, in very briefly, a big topic, but how do you go about that in the region that you're working, Meg?
Thank you. This is an insurmountably large question, which I
know. Yeah, you have 1 minute, Meg, to answer. No,
as a result, thank you for letting me fail publicly in responding to that. I guess, first, the easy solution is go back 2.5 minutes to when Mikhail was beginning to speak, because I would copy and paste everything he just said in terms of how do you set up systems to be most predisposed, and people within those ecosystems predisposed to both having, I guess what I would call, if I could name it a band, it'd be the disruptors, protectors, and incrementalists. And so, what are the systems in place, from PFM to open data policies, statistics systems, processes related, and that both gets to actually disruptors, but also sort of this incremental. There's the backbone is to the greatest extent possible not eroded when there are not necessarily other forces at play that reinforce, in particular political. Protectors also was covered earlier in this panel on how important it is to protect those that are most vulnerable to become victims of data systems or left out of, or voices not heard, as Claudia was also inviting in those. In these complex, highly chaotic systems, data can also serve a tremendous role. And I return, I guess, back to both looking at incentives and sort of more of a systems approach, because and then where are those pain points that really pull people to look towards some kind of data. It doesn't have to be perfect, and it doesn't have to be prescriptive. It should not be prescriptive, whether it's waste management or even a decision that just needs to happen that week. We focus very heavily on data culture. Is there a data culture, data utilization that one can lean into, even if it's very short-sighted, as often systems are, and data often is giving us perspectives that challenge a status quo. The current systems serve a purpose and many purposes. So any shifts where you bring in data that challenge that may be outright rejected. The body will expulse it, so to speak. And so then I return very much to the local level. These are exceptionally hardworking individuals in Nepal. Many of them elected are also only partially or completely illiterate, and they see their community members. They actually are the front face of the social contract of the governing system, as imperfect as it is. And that's where we see more interest in the disruption, more interest in protecting, and more interest in making incremental shifts. So I will thank you for letting me
thanks,
fail.
Meg, for providing a frame of disruption, protection, and incrementalism, which I think is a really powerful way of looking at this. And I might actually reuse it with advocate reference to you, Meg, moving forward as well. So, Mikhail, any question that resonated from the 10?
Yeah, definitely. I took a close look. Many of them resonated. There were some great questions. I had a hard time choosing one. I think I would like to answer or have an answer for the question, if citizens have greater access to data information, does that mobilize them to take action and engage politically? Under what circumstances does that happen? I think Claudia would have an idea of how to answer that question, but I'd love to know more about that topic.
Great, thanks so much. Over to you, Claudia. Which one did you choose? And indeed, choosing, as my parents always said, choosing is losing, but unfortunately, there's no other way. Over to you.
Yeah, well, I definitely want to have an answer that's more empirically driven than my anecdotal example to the question that Mikhail was just saying. But the question that I chose, and I chose, I'll say it first, but before I say why I chose it, but how can democracies achieve inclusion more effectively in terms of both process, meaning how decisions are made, whose voices count, and outcomes, how resources, prosperity, and well-being are distributed? And I like that question because I think it actually helps to reframe the problem that we're talking about a democratic issue here as well. Like, I think sometimes, and actually quite often and too often today, participation is treated in a very technocratic way. And I think when we see it as something that's actually democratic and can improve our democratic system as well as our governance system, it changes our approach to how we do things. And it's why I took the time to really explain what is a citizens' assembly, how does it work? Because yes, it requires much more time, much more resources, much more effort to set it up. But if we think of this as a democratic exercise, then I think we should be comparing it more to how much money and effort and infrastructure we have around other democratic processes like elections, everything that we need to make that into something that's actually beneficial for democracy. I think if we start to see citizen participation and deliberation as something that requires that same sort of democratic infrastructure and treated like the outputs actually treated in the same way, then we start to get to a whole new democratic architecture. And the work and the thinking I've been working on most recently at the OECD, actually we're publishing a new paper tomorrow that I've written called 8 Ways to Institutionalize Deliberative Democracy, really is with the same spirit in mind about how do you create a more democratic democracy in some ways for better decision making, but also for that aspect of inclusion and active citizenry, more trust between people, between government in all directions. So I would love that framing to become a lot more common.
Great, and looking forward to the paper. So tomorrow morning when I wake up, I'm constantly going to refresh the OECD website to see when it's released.
Don't worry, it'll hit your inbox.
Good. Over to you, Meg. What question did resonate from your end?
Well, I would say that I gravitate towards more abstract thinking, and the very first question definitely got my attention on democratic regression. But I'm going to put my own personal pleasures to the side, and I will say that what I see regularly in working on data in governance, for governance, and data ecosystems themselves is that we gravitate towards technical solutions. And where we need the most support is actually towards looking at the question, which I will read, which is which populations or groups are not represented in data that is collected and used for formal government decision making, and who is at most risk of being excluded from considerations that rise from data innovation. And because I observe our natural tendencies towards technical solutions, and I also, with great humility, recognize that our human history has been plagued by many missteps in overlooking questions that relate to this. And I would be of, our programming would be of tremendous service if we could have some guardrails in place that help us see where we may be falling inadvertently to the prey of biases and whatnot. This also comes from Nepal being an exceptionally small and exceptionally diverse place. And so it's a pressing issue in Nepal and the subcontinent more generally.
Thanks so much, Meg. Miguel, Claudia, Meg, thanks so much for sharing your wisdom. I've learned a lot. This was one of the most intense and enjoyable hours of conversation. For those who still want to vote on those 10 questions, the voting is still open till the end of the year. And thanks again for joining our conversation. And thanks also for your interest in how we can start using data for governance. Thanks so much. Uma, are we stopping recording now, or can I do this myself? Doesn't look like.